Hello everybody, welcome back to Anglo Election Insights. In the wake of the federal and Tassie elections, I've decided that now is the time to turn my focus to the upcoming Victorian and New South Wales state elections to be held at the end of next year and the start of 2027. Obviously a little while away, but a good time to put out some detailed analysis and really get my take out there on the record. This one could go on a little bit, so grab a cuppa and settle in and join me for a discussion on Victoria. We're focusing on the new battlegrounds, and I should really say it's also the old battlegrounds too in a sense, but this is really an examination of where this election will be won and lost and what issues and electoral forces are shaping this election at this stage. Okay, so in terms of the background, pretty simple. Victoria goes to the polls in November 2026. This will be Labor looking for a fourth term. Jacinta Allen looking to win her first election as leader. The coalition, they've obviously been thrashed twice, but you know, there's a lot going in their favour this time. The government has a much weaker leader than Daniel Andrews. They've got a lot of baggage behind them, but the Liberal Party brand in particular is in a bit of trouble with their factional infighting and perceptions about whether or not they're actually ready for government. So from the outset, the question is, where exactly will the battlegrounds be? So I'm going to give you guys four kind of main areas of interest, and I'm going to try and put them, some of them at least, into historical context. And in terms of the regional areas, we're going to focus a little bit on the election of 1999. So this was when Jeff Kennett was the Liberal leader. He was the Premier. Two big wins in 92 and 96, and he was looking for a third term. Everyone expected the Liberals to win. However, Labor had campaigned really well out in the regions. The Liberals were kind of seen as having abandoned the regional areas. There was this famous ad, which I haven't been able to find footage of, but I'm told it was like two taps. One of them was just dripping, and that was labelled Regional Victoria, and one of them was just like flowing, gushing with water, and that was like Melbourne, urban Melbourne. And it was really sort of Labor trying to tap into this kind of feeling of rural discontent with the Liberal government. And of course, Labor ended up winning that election. There were swings of up to 10% out in the regional seats, even if there wasn't a great deal of movement in Melbourne's east, which was like generally the battleground area. You can see here, this is what the map looked like in 1996. And then here's the map in 1999. I am kind of simplifying what happened. There was also these three rural independents who played a key role in delivering government to Labor ultimately. But again, just look at what's happening in these regional areas, particularly like the provincial cities, Ballarat, Geelong, Bendigo, and this area sort of around Seymour, around through the Macedon Ranges, just all flips red. And then even if you look at eastern Melbourne, it's actually quite static. Yeah, a couple of seats flip, but really all the damage is done here in the regions. So, coming back to 2026, it's Labor who now has a bit of a regional Victorian problem. Obviously, the infrastructure delivery in Melbourne with the level crossing removals and the upcoming opening of the Metro Tunnel, and there'll be the Westgate Tunnel as well, and a lot of other big infrastructure projects in Melbourne have driven some good results in suburban Melbourne, particularly in the east. But the feeling in the bush is that there's been a lot less delivered for the regions under this government, whether it's the amalgamation of health services, particularly things like poor road maintenance, the lack of public transport infrastructure development. Maybe if you're down in South Barwon, you're getting some level crossing removals, but the regions are just kind of getting drip fed with a few extra train services maybe, or the reduced fares, something like that. But it's nothing quite like what what's being promised and delivered in suburban Melbourne. And then there, particularly as of this year, 2025, there's definitely been a lot of local opposition to this government ignited out in the bush. Things like the Great Forest National Park, the treaty negotiations, and the native title claims, and how that pertains to farmland and private property, the fast tracking of renewable projects. You've got the implementation of the emergency services fire levy. You've also got that lingering effect of the Commonwealth Games cancellation, which was, a lot was promised to regional Victoria over the 2022 election campaign, and that basically went up in smoke. So there's a lot of reasons for some rural and regional discontent with the Allen government. So if we have a look at how this could play out on the map, these are the colours here represent targets, not necessarily like a prediction, but the Liberals will be looking to make gains, particularly in the marginals of Ripon and Bass, and then also Eureka. I also think they're half a chance in the seat of South Barwon, mostly because of Darren Cheeseman not stepping aside. I think he's used question time pretty poorly, not really representing his local region all that well, and that could certainly turn voters against Labor, even if he's no longer sitting as a member of that party. Then again, if the regional swing is really on, seats like Macedon, Wendouree and Bellarine are potentially in play as well. And then the Nats have a really strong branch in Bendigo, which they built up during the federal campaign, where they obviously did really well in the seat of Bendigo and nearly took it off Labor, despite the national trend away from the coalition. And I think the same candidate is looking to run in Bendigo East, and on a really good night, maybe Bendigo West could be under threat as well, although that's asking a lot. I think Bendigo West is on a margin of like 15% or something. So then when we look at kind of eastern Melbourne and the sandbelt, the ghost of 2010 is one to keep in mind. So this was when Labor was once again looking to win a historic fourth term under the new leadership of John Brumby, who was relatively popular. They were polling relatively well. No one really expected them to lose, but this big swing came, and the coalition made sort of moderate gains in all the usual battlegrounds, but they managed to really rebuild their presence in eastern Melbourne back to kind of 1990s levels, which was crucial. But also they won 4 key sandbelt marginal seats up and down Port Phillip Bay, and we'll see these on the map. So if you look here, Labor obviously winning some of these middle ring eastern suburbs, and quite strong along the coast of Port Phillip Bay, and then suddenly the Liberals kind of just fill in these eastern suburbs, and here they are: Bentley, Mordialloc, Carrum and Frankston. So winning those 4 seats was sort of the knockout blow, and really unexpected win for the Liberals that year. As far as how that could play out this time, the Liberals definitely need to rebuild at least some of that former eastern heartland. So Glen Waverley, Bayswater and I'm saying Ringwood as well are the 3 key seats that they would definitely need to win. Ringwood because it's currently held by another exiled Labor MP who is a little bit more popular locally, and I have heard suggestions that he could run again as an independent. So we could have a bit of a federal seat of more type situation where Labor's potential vote is split between 2 candidates, and maybe some preference leakage is enough to deliver the seat to the Liberals. It is in an area that's probably broadly trending away from the Liberals. I think it lies within the federal seat of Deakin, but it's not violently trending away. So it is one that I think the Liberals have a good chance of picking up if they have a good night. And then Box Hill and Ashwood, these are seats that back in 2010, these would have been much safer. I think Ashwood is actually the former seat of Burwood, basically, which was Kennett's seat. So this really is heartland territory, but the implementation of SRL East and some of the demographic change and Labor's advantage with like Chinese Australian voters in particular is really changing the game in these types of seats. So they're not going to be free pickups at all. And then looking down the sandbelt, the same 4 seats would all be in play on a good night. I think Frankston and Carrum in particular, looking at what happened federally in Dunkley, where despite the big metropolitan shifts away from the Liberals, that didn't really occur there, and some of these issues around crime in particular could be tapped into with a good Liberal campaign. I guess Mordialloc and Bentley would both be in play too on a good night. And then finally here I've got Paran, which they obviously won at the by-election in quite exceptional circumstances. It's going to be a really difficult one to hold, but if they're going to form government, it's probably one that they need to win. I guess if the Greens remain in second place and there's a bit of preference leakage from Labor, that could be perhaps their best chance. So then the new frontiers, these are the seats or the suburbs and areas that have been traditional Labor strongholds, so the more working class and multicultural, lower socioeconomic areas to the northwest of Melbourne's CBD, and also down in the southeast around sort of the Dandenong area. So obviously in 2022 at both the federal and the state level, we saw big swings away from Labor on primary vote and relatively big swings on two-party preferred as well in some areas. As I've always said, though, the key caveat here is that the Liberals don't have a great party structure. So they're going to have to find good candidates, and they're going to have to find a way of the party being able to materially support them properly on the ground. But I'm saying there are green shoots because of these 2 by-election results that have happened over the course of this term. So we've got the seat of Mulgrave, where Labor's primary went down nearly 11%, and then in Werribee, when the government's position had worsened quite a bit, they were down 16.5%. So if you look at the two-party preferred, on a sort of notionally two-party preferred level, Mulgrave is actually quite marginal now, and Werribee is razor thin. And then also Paul Hopper's West Party. I guess particularly in the seat of Werribee itself, Paul Hopper's name carries a bit of weight. But if the swings are on against the ALP, but they're not really going straight to the Liberal Party, they could go through popular local independents. So if they're able to launch a really solid campaign and really engage the local electorates, they could find themselves in second place in some of these electorates out west and do really well out of that. But that really remains to be seen. This slide's a little bit confusing, but we're looking mostly for the shading of some of these Labor seats. So in 2018, we've got, this is kind of the southeast. You can see some deep red turns to a little bit lighter red, and then particularly in the northwest, you can see this really deep red, really safe Labor seats becoming a lot more marginal. All right. As for how this looks on the map, obviously much more room to grow here for the coalition. So out in the northwest, I would say that Yanyin and Melton remain their best prospects. They definitely need to pick those 2 up. But if the swing's really on in this part of Melbourne, seats like Sunbury, Niddry, Greenvale, and even Point Cook are probably the next dominoes to fall. And then I'm saying that in Werribee, Hopper's name, sort of at that personal level, could be quite crucial here. And even in a place like St Albans, if the West Party are able to pick a really good candidate, really connect with that kind of community and resonate, then that could be the type of seat where there's a big swing against Labor, but the Liberals don't soak much of it up, and a really good sort of independent or West Party candidate is someone who could get up. But again, I'm really asking a lot. They don't have a great deal of presence. They're a bit of an upstart, But there was a little bit of proof of concept in 2022, and then obviously we saw at the Werribee by-election with Hopper himself. There is definitely a bit of demand for that kind of independent in this part of Melbourne. And then when you look into the southeast, obviously seats like Hastings, Bass, Pakenham, they're going to need to add them back to their pile. The Narre Warrens and Cranbourne on a good night, and then Mulgrave too, given that that's now quite a close marginal without Daniel Andrews as the local member. And I should really caveat these by-election results by saying that they were triggered by the resignation of two very high-profile MPs in Daniel Andrews and Tim Pallas, and that could have had a bit of an impact in the Labor primary. And of course, in by-elections, you expect bigger swings against incumbents if they're in a bad position, because you can lodge a bit of a protest vote without actually threatening to change the government. Whereas at the general election, obviously, there's a little bit more weight behind your vote, I suppose. So then finally, we have the inner city. And I've been talking a lot about where the coalition could gain at Labor's expense, but here we can talk a little bit more about three-way contests and the change of seats between Labor, the Greens, and the Liberals. So the Liberals currently hold two close marginals, which will be targeted by the progressive forces and Labor, and then the Greens, while from over the long term leading up to 2022, they built up a lot of momentum, and they're now sort of on the cusp of winning several seats in inner Melbourne. But as we saw in the federal election, that momentum completely stalled out, and they actually went backwards in seats like Melbourne and McNamara. So whether or not that continues to play out at the state level, or if they can actually build on what they achieved in seats like Wills, for example, that we'll have a little bit of a closer look, but they could find themselves recovering quite a lot of that lost federal vote at the state level. And then as for Labor, they're not out of it either. Those big swings against the Greens on primary in seats like Melbourne and McNamara could be crucial, pardon me, if they play out at the state level too. So having a look at where the action might be, the Greens heavily targeted seats like Footscray, Pascoe, Preston and Northcote, and they nearly won all four of them. But whether or not Liberal preferences are going to go their way this time remains to be seen. But looking at what happened in the seat of Wills with that sort of slightly further out vote in terms of like distance from the CBD, the trend was generally that the more affluent, younger professional vote moved from the Greens to Labor, but that lower socio-economic and more diverse vote tended to move from Labor to the Greens. So that would probably put them in a really good position in a place like Footscray and possibly somewhere like Pascoe, but maybe less so in Northcote and Preston. Labor, for their part, I think will be heavily targeting Richmond. They'll be looking to take back Richmond. There were big swings against the Greens in the Richmond booths at the federal level. No one expected the Labor to win the seat of Melbourne at the federal level. They might be looking for a repeat performance on Liberal preferences at the state level. And then the Liberal held seats of Paran and Hawthorn. Hawthorn could be a little bit more interesting, particularly if Climate 200 once again enters the race. But Paran, I think, will be a genuine three-way contest between Labor, the Greens, and the Liberals, who currently hold it. I think if Labor are able to stay ahead of the Greens candidate, they could easily counter home of Green preferences, and that's definitely in play. I think the Liberals would really struggle to poll enough primary vote in order to not have Labor overtake them on Green preferences, but they could stay ahead if it's Labor preferences to the Greens. So a really interesting three-way battle there. All right, so let's have a quick look at some polling. So these are the last kind of half dozen or so polls that have been taken of state voting intention. Labor lost the lead in late 2024, but they've since retaken it after the federal election. But it was a pretty big defeat for the federal Liberals, which might affect the sample, which there's that kind of halo effect which could be influencing those numbers, but it could also have a lot to do with more kind of Liberal infighting, more drama with Moira Deeming and John Pizzuto just dragging their brand down. When we look at the leadership ratings, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting though. So Jacinta Allen obviously heavily underwater in terms of her satisfaction ratings, and Brad Batten actually managed to debut as leader well ahead of her on preferred premier, which is a question that tends to skew towards the incumbents. So Labor definitely have a leadership problem, and as I've kind of said before, I think there's a fair chance that she won't be the leader coming into the next election, which would place her seat of Bendigo East possibly at even more risk. And as for Brad Batten, I think the voters are relatively neutral towards him, but the party itself, he's kind of facing opposition and division from both sides of his party, which he's really struggling to keep together. He's having to make concessions to both the moderates and the conservatives, and basically they both seem to resent him for it. So yeah, it looks like neither leader might be the most likely one to still be leader come the election. I also wanted to pull apart these Redbridge sub-regional samples. So here we've got a succession of published Redbridge polls spanning from the tail end of the Andrews era all the way till basically last month. And here I've got the headline results of each poll for your reference. But looking at these first two readings, you can see that the Liberals' heartland areas of the Northeast Metro and Southern Metro, they're still kind of holding up, but everywhere else they were just completely underwater. And what's really interesting to me is these rural and regional upper house regions, so Western and Eastern and Northern Victoria. And then in the December reading, you can sort of see why. Even in rural communities, Labor had the lead by 3%, but in the provincial cities, that 46% primary vote, that's huge. And I think Western Victoria, which is home to both Geelong and Ballarat, that was probably a big contributor there. So Labor riding really high in those regional cities. But then you can see that advantage in regional Victoria was eroded quite quickly. By late 2024, the Liberals had the lead in the regionals. They extended it by April during the campaign period. And then even though in this last reading Labor got back ahead, the Liberals much further increased their lead in rural and regional Victoria. So, just have a look in the difference of primary vote in this rural communities reading from December 2023 to last month, going from 37% of the vote all the way up to 50%. So a near majority of the vote in these rural communities. And then even more shocking for me is the provincial cities, which, in Victoria at least, they're not based around primary or raw industry so much. There's a lot of public servants that live in these provincial cities, and they, at least in the case of Geelong and Ballarat in particular, they sort of sit within Melbourne's orbit, and they do have a sort of secondary function as commuter belt cities. So they're a lot more friendly to Labor than, say, the more working class central Queensland provincial cities, for example. And you can see Labor's vote here has dropped from 46% all the way down to 29%. And the Greens have gobbled a fair bit of that up, but so have the Liberals, and now they're nearly even on two-party preferred, which if they can actually take the lead there and extend those trends coming into the election, that would mean that that's we're probably talking about like double-digit swings, and seats like Geelong, Bellarine, Lara, Wendouree. We start talking about really big swings that would threaten currently safe Labor seats. But what would be concerning for them is what's happening in the outer suburbs. You can see, some of these two-party preferred readings, 6 points behind. Then they got ahead. It's really annoying how the names of these sub-regional groups change, so it's really hard to make comparisons. But obviously in this reading, the reason why Labor are ahead is because they've really gained in these multicultural outer suburban areas, which was a feature of their federal campaign, how they really turned it around and managed to gain the upper hand there. It looks like, at least at this stage, that has filtered through at the state level. And then just a note on the federal trends. So here in Victoria, the swing was much less against the Liberals. I think it was 1% or a little bit less. So I'm calling the trend from 2022 to 2025 1.5% to the ALP generally. So if a seat swung by less than that amount towards Labor, then that would make it a trend towards the Liberals, if that makes sense. So these are, when I looked up and down my potential pendulum, I identified these seats. If the Liberals won all of them, they'd win government, basically. And you can see here the overlapping federal seats. A lot of them have a slight trend towards the Liberals. So even though more broadly that sort of Dutton outer suburban strategy was seen as a bit of a failure, in Victoria it actually played out a little bit, at least a little bit. And in seats like Corangamite, Dunkley, Hawke, Lawler, they didn't go backwards. Or if they did, it was only by, like a non-significant amount. So I do think that if Brad Batten is able to employ that strategy to much greater effect, some of those trends absolutely could come to life. All right, so that's the end of the slides. I just wanted to, before I finish, take you to the map as I currently see it. And thanks to the commenter who pointed out the relatively simple step I needed to take to actually generate this map on YAPMS. Kind of embarrassing that I didn't know how to do it anyway, but thank you to that commenter. So at the moment, with Labor holding a lead in the polls, I've got them winning 43 seats, which is one short of a majority. They'd be able to form minority government with the Greens based on this map. I've also left 5 toss-up seats in there, so they could still form majority based on where I think the map is. I'll start in the regions. So obviously the Nats cleaning up north of the divide mostly, and the Liberals doing quite well in the south. The seat of Benambra, the sitting Liberal MP is retiring. The last 2 elections, an independent called Jackie Hawkins has contested, and she's made it quite a close marginal seat, but I'm not sure she's going to go again. And I know that the Nats are actively looking for a candidate, so I've got it as a Liberal marginal, but mostly because I'm not quite sure which of the coalition parties is going to gain the upper hand there, but I do think that'll be a coalition seat. I have Ripon flipping, which, as a resident of Ripon, that really feels like that swing is on. The behaviour of the sitting Labor MP is indicative of someone who's quite aware that the Labor brand is seriously on the nose here, and she's basically fighting a lone battle within the party to kind of represent regional Victoria and some of their concerns. And it's almost at the point where she could possibly defect from the party and sit on the crossbench. She's that much at odds with the rest of the Labor caucus, but we'll see. Looking a little bit closer to Melbourne, I think Eureka is at serious threat as well. Similar reasons. Anywhere in Western Victoria really is kind of feeling the pinch from these renewable projects, and just the general attitude and perception that regional Victorians have towards the Allen government. And then looking in the southwest, I think the Liberals are a good chance to win back Hastings and Bass on statewide swing. So if we jump in a bit closer, I should mention Bendigo East too, just given how unpopular Allen is personally, and how well the Nats did and how well they were able to target the Bendigo area, I think her seat comes under threat too. And if they flick her as leader, I think she would probably just resign from politics, and the Nats would potentially win the resulting by-election as well. So if we have a look at Melbourne, I have the Liberals just with the edge in the outer marginals of Yanyan and Melton. Werribee is a toss-up at the moment, I think, partly because I'm not sure what impact Paul Hopper would have with a full campaign behind him. I think Labor have the edge in the rest of these northwestern suburban seats though, and I think currently Labor are just favoured to retain South Barwon despite the efforts of Darren Cheeseman. Looking more to the southeast, Labor mostly on track to hold their eastern seats, I would say, but the three key ones would be Mulgrave, Bayswater and Ringwood. Obviously the Liberals would need to win all three, and ultimately they'd probably need to win a couple of more to be competitive. According to me, with this map, they're only on kind of 36 seats out of the block, so they need to find another 7 or 8 to form government effectively. But I do have them winning Pakenham, winning back Glen Waverley as well. And then for central Melbourne, I think the Greens do have the slight edge in Paran, but that's going to be an unpredictable three-way contest. I think they'll hold on to Melbourne. I think Labor gains Richmond, and I think Footscray goes green this time, but Labor are able to hold the other seats that the Greens will be looking to target. One interesting thing about the Greens, though, I'm not sure how influential the Palestine issue will be by the time of the state election, but I do think in recent weeks I've sensed that the electorate is moving on that issue, and there is an undertone of dissatisfaction with Israel and what they've been doing, and I think the federal conversation will become a lot less sympathetic towards Israel, and that I don't know if that's going to have significant electoral consequences in terms of the Victorian state election, but I do think that the Greens' position is going to be seen with a little bit more sympathy then than perhaps it was in the federal election. But whether or not that actually has ramifications for the election, I don't particularly know. Alright guys, I think that'll do for today. So thanks for sticking it out if you've watched this far. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll be looking to do a similar deep dive on New South Wales in future weeks as well. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and comment your thoughts below. Always love to hear what you guys think. And if you've not already subscribed, but you are watching the content and you'd like to see more, please subscribe and enjoy the rest of your day. See you later.